for this next session presented to you by MIT Press, The Future is Now, with Meredith Broussard and Toby Walsh in conversation with Anupama Raju. Meredith Broussard is the author of Artificial Unintelligence, How Computers Misunderstand the World. Her research focuses on artificial intelligence in investigative reporting, with a particular interest in using data analysis for social good. Toby Walsh is an Australian professor of artificial intelligence. He regularly appears in the media talking about artificial intelligence and robotics. His latest book is 2062, The Book That AI Made. And our moderator for this morning's session is Anupama Raju, a poet, literary journalist, and translator. She was the Charles Wallace Fellow at the University of Kent in the UK and a writer-in-residence at the Centres Intermondes in La Rochelle in France. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the speakers presented by MIT Press this morning, Meredith Broussard, Toby Walsh, and Anupama Raju.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. So, as you know, this is going to be a discussion on artificial intelligence. Perhaps 50 years from now, we would have a robot as a moderator. I'm not sure, but till such time, I'm happy to be in conversation with two very special people who've devoted their lives to understanding AI. So this question is to both of you, and I'd really like to know, how did you both find your calling in AI? How did it all begin? Would you like to start, Meredith?
Sure. Thanks. I'm really excited to be here. So I have kind of a complicated history. I started my career as a computer scientist, and then I quit to become a journalist. And I came back to computer science as a data journalist. So data journalism is the practice of finding stories in numbers and using numbers to tell stories. So what I do now is I write computer code in order to commit acts of investigative reporting.
Fantastic. Toby?
So I started dreaming about this as a very young boy. Back then, it was a very analog world. We didn't have personal computers. We didn't have games consoles. We didn't have mobile phones. I didn't have any digital devices. But it's a nice story to say that it was books. It was the idea, the dreams in books that gave me the idea that we should think about this wonderful technology and try and build it. And I wanted to be part of that future. So the answer is that scientists actually work within the envelope of the dreams that writers tell us. And so I read Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, and they wrote about a future full of robots and intelligent machines, because our future is full of robots and intelligent machines. And it's taken longer, but now the nice thing is I think the rest of the world is waking up to the idea of those dreams that those writers planted in my mind those 40 or 50 years ago.
Fantastic, thank you. And talking of books, today is the official launch of the paperback version of Meredith's book, Artificial Unintelligence. Can we have a round of applause for that? So,
thank you so much.
Do buy it if you haven't bought it already, and there will be a book signing after the session. You know, a lot of fiction, you know, movies like Terminator and The Space Odyssey. I'm sure, how many of you have watched Terminator here? There you go. So a lot of movies and a lot of fiction have kind of portrayed computers and machines as these evil things that take over humanity. And they've kind of put the fear of the Lord in all of us. So what is there to fear about artificial intelligence, and what is there to embrace about it?
I think there's very little to fear. Hollywood has colored our ideas about artificial intelligence a lot. And so I think it's important to make the distinction between the Hollywood kind of AI and the real kind of AI. So I like to start with a definition of artificial intelligence, because we talk a lot about AI sometimes without being very specific about what we're talking about. So artificial intelligence is a branch of computer science, the same way that algebra is a branch of mathematics. And inside artificial intelligence, you've got lots of different subfields, like there's machine learning, there's natural language processing, there's expert systems, there's other stuff. But machine learning is the one that's really popular right now. And so there's been a little bit of linguistic confusion where when people say artificial intelligence now in the business context, usually what they mean is machine learning being used for business. So like when you go to the airport and you see those big signs that say AI, cyber, blah, blah, blah for your business, and they have those like menacing pictures, like that generally means machine learning. And machine learning, one way of understanding it is that it's basically computational statistics on steroids. Right? So we've got that. And then we've got two concepts of general AI and narrow AI. And general AI is the Hollywood stuff. It's really fun to imagine, and it's the killer robots, and it's really entrancing. But it's not real. And narrow AI is what we have, and it is mathematical. And I'm not that scared of math.
Okay, that's great. Toby, what is your view?
Well, it's at the moment, it's not malevolence. It's not the robots are going to take over. It's not any of these Terminator things that we should be worried about. It's incompetence. That we're giving decisions to machines, and they're actually not capable of making those decisions in a way that's fair or meets the values of the society that we would like it to be. So I'm much more worried in the short term that we're handing responsibility to machines, and we haven't really worried carefully enough about the consequences of that and what sort of world it's going to be. But equally, I don't think we can dismiss those fears that people have, because they're deep-rooted stories, that creational stories that run through cultures that say something about what sort of world we are expecting in 100 or 200 years' time.
Right. So in your book, 2062, the world that AI made, you refer to a future which would be kind of, devoid of chaos and kind of clinical. Now, maybe as a writer, as a poet, my concern is this, and maybe that is my fear too. A lot of beauty comes out of chaos. In a world that is devoid
Welcome to India, the land of chaos.
In a world devoid of chaos, how do you think it would influence our imagination?
That's a really interesting question. I should probably start by saying, why is the book entitled 2062?
Sure.
That's because when I surveyed 300 of my colleagues, that was when, on average, they expected machines would be as capable as humans. I should say there was huge uncertainty in their answers. But the important thing to realize is it's not going to happen in the next couple of years, despite what all the newspapers would have you believe. But it's not going to take 1,000 years. It's going to happen in the next 50 or 100 years. Maybe if we're really bad at building the 200 years. But it's that sort of scale of problem that it could happen in our lifetimes, certainly the lifetimes of our children. And I think that your question hints at actually the point that we humans, we're terrible at making decisions. We're terribly irrational. We wouldn't buy lottery tickets if we really seriously understood decision-making. And computers offer the promise, if we're careful, to actually have a much cleaner, more rational, fairer world to be in. That doesn't mean that all the things that are important to us, we can just give to the machines the things that we want and leave the things that we like doing to ourselves.
Yes, but at the same time, you said a fairer world. Don't have machines have their own bias? I mean, Meredith, what is your view?
Well, at the end of the day, they're bits of code that we're making these decisions. That's just mathematics. And mathematics doesn't have an opinion, but it reflects the values of the people who made it. Yeah. It reflects the values of the data maybe on which it was trained. And we have lots of examples already today of how, if we're not careful, those decisions might be racist or sexist or ageist, all the things that we spent the last 50 or 100 years in many of our societies trying to get rid of. Right. And if we're not careful, we'll bake them back into this decision-making that we give to machines. But the promise, if we're careful, ultimately is that we could make better decisions for machines, because machines don't have all of the terrible behavioral biases that humans have. The behavioral psychology literature is full of examples of how we make bad decisions and how biased and racist we can be, even if we try to be very careful. So machines offer the promise that we could end up in a better world, a fairer world, a world that's more transparent. But it's not if we don't work very hard at it, and we haven't worked hard enough at that problem yet.
Right, Meredith.
Well, that idea that computers are better than people is an idea that I call Techno Chauvinism. The idea that technology is superior to humans. And I think that I would push back against that idea a little bit because what computers do is very, very straightforward. And we do have plenty of examples right now of how when we turn decision-making over to computational systems, these computational systems discriminate by default because the world is racist, the world is sexist, the world has all kinds of economic inequality, of structural inequality. And what machine learning systems do, what AI systems do, is they take data about the world as it is, and then they just reproduce that, right? So they will reproduce the world as it is without getting us to the world as it should be. And then when you take existing social problems and you reproduce them in code, it makes them hard to see and impossible to improve.
I'm going to be the techno-optimist and root for the machines, because at the end of the day, machines are already superior to us in many respects. If you're Lee Sedol, then you know the computers play Go better than any human. The Chinese call it a Go god. So clearly there are some decisions that computers can make better than any humans. The question is, I agree completely, if we're not careful and we train it on data that has historical biases, because it is data, it reflects whatever society had been doing up to that point in time, that if we're not careful, then it may just perpetuate those biases. But there's no reason, if we work out, well, what does it mean to be fair? What does it mean to be not to discriminate on the grounds of sex or race or age or any of these things that we would like? Then we have a very precise mathematical object in which that can make those decisions that we can prove even is fair, and that's better than humans. Not that we necessarily give all those, I'm not saying that we have to give all decisions to machines, but there are some decisions that we could do fair and better with machines.
Well, I
think the idea that like making a decision with math is superior to making a decision not with math is an idea that we can challenge.
Right. So we'll come to that. And at this point, I just want to point out to the audience that this is not a debate. Toby is not for AI and Meredith is not anti-AI. We're just having a fascinating...
I am for AI.
Okay.
I spent my whole life trying to build AI because I think it has the potential to make the world a better place.
Better place.
And technology has always made the world ultimately a better place. And this is just another technology.
Sure.
But we've got to work out how to use the technology.
How to use it.
And just using the technology without thinking carefully about how it's going to make the world a better place. It's just the same as how chemistry doesn't make the world a better place if we're not careful about making sure that we're not over-fertilizing the world.
Right.
The nuclear industry isn't going to make the world a better place unless we think carefully about it. It's just another technology. It's another tool. And at the end of the day, humans are the most supreme tool users.
Thank God. Yes.
Has got us here.
Yes, and both of you do talk about the choices we need to make today to make, how to make AI work better for us. So that is interesting. And in your book, Meredith, let's talk about the title a bit. Artificial Unintelligence. And how did you, what was the idea behind it? Because it's really fascinating.
Well, so literally the first line of the book is, I love technology.
Yeah.
And I open the book with a story about when I was a little girl and I tried to build a robot. And I thought that this robot was going to be just the greatest thing. I thought it was going to dance with me. I thought it was going to play fetch because my dog wouldn't play fetch, so I thought I could build a robot who could play fetch. And so I built this robot, and I was so excited, and I put in the batteries, and it didn't work because some part in the motor was broken. And so my mom explained to me that this happens, that motors are made in factories, and factories have problems, and sometimes there are production problems. And so we got a new motor, and we eventually made it work. But it was not as exciting as I thought it would be. And I've kind of kept this lesson with me because often we imagine that technology is going to be so great, and it's going to be so transformative, and it's going to make us propel us into this amazing new world. And it does lots of really great things, but it's not really as magical as we imagine. So our imagination is magnificent, but often there are things that are broken inside computers. And so I think we need to keep that in mind and be realistic about what technology can and can't do.
Right.
So that's where the title came from.
Great. Now, I just want to talk about a couple of trends which are highly popular right now. Let's talk about driverless cars. So this is your first time in India. And Toby, what about you? Have you?
I've been a few times, but I was already in a taxi 2 days ago that was run into by another car. So.
Oops.
So I can see that driving in India is a much greater challenge than driving almost anywhere else on the planet.
Right. It is a great experience. Yes. I drive. I'm the driver of the family. I can tell you for certain. Right. So what do you think about driverless cars, and would they help or harm a driving culture like India's?
Well, I think the first thing to point out is, for the world as a whole, they're a great benefit. 1 million people will die in road traffic accidents around the planet in the next year, most of which are caused by bad driving. It's not mechanical failure that causes most accidents, it's human error, human judgment, again, that's wrong. And autonomous vehicles have the promise in the next 10 or 15 years to take that away in most countries. I think India is probably going to be about the last, from my experience of Indian driving, India is probably about the last place that driverless cars are going to be able to penetrate, just because people drive on both sides of the road. It's just going to be so much more challenging to build algorithms that can cope with Indian drivers. But ultimately, it will save us that great carnage that happens on our roads. The major cause of death in most developed countries for men under the age of 30 is road traffic accident. Most of us know someone whose life has been touched, whose family has been touched by one of these tragedies. And so that will go away. Plus, there will be great economic benefits as well. The cost of transporting goods will plummet. So there's huge, great benefits. And quite frankly, I hate driving. I can't wait to have that time given to me so that I can get on with the important things in my life. So there are benefits. It's not going to be as easy, I think, as some people think. And certainly in India, it's not going to be as easy as anyone can think. But
yes.
We will get there, and it will make most people's lives, unless you're someone whose income is driving, most people's lives, the rest of us, will make our lives much better. But then we need to think about what happens to those people who are taxi drivers and truck drivers, rickshaw drivers, whose employment might be going away. That's an important part of the equation as well.
Yes, Meredith, driverless cars.
I am against driverless cars. One of the things I wrote about in the book is a ride that I took in a driverless car, in a very early driverless car, and it almost killed me. The car just drove straight toward this giant cement pillar in the middle of a parking lot, and it kind of screeched to a stop right beforehand. And the engineers in the car kind of shrugged and said, "Oops." And the idea that they were just so careless with human lives gave me pause. And so when you look at really what's happening inside driverless cars, how all of the sensing systems are working together and how fragile those systems are, you become really skeptical of this vision of the driverless car future, which people have been talking about actually since 1991, and they've been saying, it's coming soon, it's coming soon. So one of the things that I think about is the image sensing systems. So the way a driverless car works is it has all kinds of sensors on it, and the sensors have to take in the image data from the world around you and identify the objects and say, is this object moving, is it not moving, what rate is it moving at, and how do I need to react? So if you do the CAPTCHA online and you have to click all of the things that say, is this a stop sign? Or click all the boxes that include a stop sign. That is part of what's used to train driverless cars to recognize stop signs. So what a driverless car does is it recognizes a stop sign, and then it launches a subroutine that says, all right, slow down and stop before the line that is right before the stop sign. And again, this is, in the US, we have stop signs and lines, and the roads are pretty well maintained. So it's a very geographically bounded problem. But these image recognition algorithms are very easily defeated. So if I were to go around and I were to put a sparkly unicorn sticker onto a stop sign, the self-driving car would no longer recognize it as a stop sign and would go straight through and would cause an accident. And that's not safe. There are all kinds of flaws in the programs as they are implemented that I think advocates are minimizing. Another thing to think about is the jobs that are going to be taken away from taxi drivers, from rickshaw drivers. And another thing to think about is the invisible labor that all of these workers do. So I get motion sick, for one thing. And I am going to admit something embarrassing now, which is that I have thrown up in taxis. And I'm not the only person in the world who has done this. And I, hopefully open the door and it's not a problem. But I've talked to taxi drivers, and it's not an uncommon problem. Taxi drivers are, familiar with this problem. And in fact, in Chicago, there's kind of a standard fine of $200 if you throw up in a taxi, and it's posted in the taxi. This is so common. So I would ask, who's going to clean driverless cars? If there's no driver, then inevitably, some taxi is going to show up and pick you up, and it's going to be full of garbage because cars get full of garbage.
And who'll put down
it's
the
going to have
glass?
a pile of vomit in it.
Who'll put down the glass for you?
That's hardly going to stop autonomous cars. They're just going to drive off to someone who's going to clean them, or there'll be a cleaning robot. So I think that's a modest problem that will be fixed.
But what about the possibility of hacking into driverless cars?
Yeah, we should be very worried that the cybersecurity of vehicles isn't adequate today, and they've already driven cars off the road. We're going to have to beef up the cybersecurity of our devices, not just our cars, actually everything in our homes, because they will become targets. And but equally, you know, it's like all technologies. There's good and there's bad that's going to come with it. And it's about us working out about how can we get the good? How can we not get the people being killed by road traffic accidents? How can we give people the mobility? The people, you've got to remember the other positives, right? So aged people are too old to drive. My father's just stopped driving because he said he's not safe to drive anymore. Well, he's lost his mobility. It's really changed his life badly, but he'll get that back with driverless cars. Young people who are too young to drive, disabled people who aren't actually physically able to drive, all of those will be given the mobility that us able-bodied people take for granted. So there are plenty of benefits that can come, but how do we make sure that we don't get the negatives? I mean, as another benefit, we have the most recent terrorist weapon today is a truck that you rent. And terrorists around the world in Nice and various other places in Berlin have rented these trucks and driven them into people. Well, that won't be possible in 20 years' time because every car will have a camera that when it sees a person in front will just stop. And you won't be able to drive cars into people anymore. And terrorists won't be able to use that weapon anymore. It will just go away. So there are lots of benefits that we can have if we can work out all the challenges that Meredith is talking about. I mean, like all technologies, there will be challenges. But in 50 years' time, it will be like horses. Most of us don't know how to ride a horse anymore, but 100 years ago, most of us did. Only rich people who do it as a hobby will be able to drive cars, and only rich people can ride horses today.
Well, I mean, let's talk about weaponization of cars, because I hear you that terrorists won't be able to drive cars into groups of people or drive them into buildings, but what they will be able to do is fill the trunk with C4 and cause an explosion. Or what they will be able to do is fill a driverless car with fertilizer soaked in gasoline and leave it in a parking lot, or drive it over a bridge and trigger it. So, I mean, there are lots of other
they can already do that today with cars that they brainwash people to doing. So that's not going to go away. That exists today. And again, technology is only one part of the solution as ever. But I don't think autonomous trucks or cars make this any greater challenge. Offers the potential for some significant benefit. So no technology comes purely with just benefits. Everything, antibiotics, which is the technology you can think of that has almost the most benefits, does have a few negatives. I mean, we do become antibiotic resistant. It does make us run the risk of becoming a bit complacent to the challenges that some of these diseases that pose the world. But like all technologies, you're not going to have 100% good things come with it, just as with any other technology.
Right. Meredith, you are a data journalist, and it's using data to tell stories and finding stories in numbers. I find that really interesting. Tell us a bit about your work as a data journalist.
Well, so what I do as a data journalist is similar to what investigative journalists do, but I use data sets in order to find stories. So one of the things that I do in my classes is I teach students how to find data, and then I teach them how to analyze the data using various technological tools, and I teach them how to turn those insights into stories, which is easier said than done, because data can seem opaque, and so you really have to get into the questions of who made the data, what was the ideology of the person making the data, what agenda were they trying to promote in making this data, and when you think about things like that, you can push back against decisions that were made using that data that were unfair, because there are there are lots of problematic decisions that are made with data, just like there are lots of problematic decisions that are not made with data. And one of the things that journalists do is we act as watchdogs. We act as, we hold decision makers accountable. So one of the things we do in this new technological world is we use data in order to do that. One of the things I like to think about when I think about data is I like to think about a friend of mine who teaches first grade. And he has this project where every Monday, 2 of the first graders in his class go around and count the pockets of the kids in the room. And they make tally marks on a sheet of paper. And it's very cute, like, to imagine these little kids going around and counting pockets, right? Because kids think pockets are really fascinating. They're like, ooh, what could be in the pocket? And they keep all kinds of weird stuff in there. So ultimately, all data is socially constructed. Ultimately, all data is constructed by people who are doing the equivalent of these first graders who are going around and counting pockets. And so when we think about it that way, we can pull apart the social forces that go into creating data, and we can pull apart what kind of agenda might be happening behind the scenes. So for example, we can understand the ways that racial inequality and gender inequality is perpetuated inside technological systems by looking at who makes the data and what are they doing with that data.
Great. My next question is relevant because we're sitting at probably one of the world's largest literature festivals. I'm also a poet who works for a technology company. So what is the relationship, according to both of you, between literature and AI? Is there one at all?
Well, there's a deep question which goes back more than 200 years to Ada Lovelace, the very first computer programmer, the daughter of Lord Byron, a mathematical prodigy, who is generally considered to be the first person to write a computer program. And she despite the fact that she realized that this computer didn't just manipulate numbers, those numbers could stand for musical notes or letters in a sentence, she said, but the computer has no pretense to originate anything, which raised the question that's haunted the field ever since, which is, could computers ever be said to be creative, and therefore could they ever create any literature? And of course the jury is still out on the answer to that question. But the answer I give in my book is that the answer is yes, and I suspect we can get computers to create things at the surface level that match those that humans create, paintings and music and maybe literature. We just won't care, because they won't speak to the things that are human. They won't speak about love and loss and mortality, because those are only things that humans experience. Yeah. And so maybe at a surface level, we can get machines to make these sorts of works of art and create things that look like the things that human authors, human painters, human musicians create, that we just won't care about those things the machines make as much. And so the job of a writer, I think, is one of the safest jobs. The job of a taxi driver
Good to know.
Is one that we should be talking about what's going to happen to those jobs.
Right. So, because we also have these absurd things like the Legato machine. I mean, Jonathan Swift wrote about it in his Gulliver's Travels ages ago, where you had this largest machine which could generate phrases and words, and you have an online version of it these days. So, yes, Meredith, what is your view?
Well, I will say I am very worried about writers' jobs. I think more writers should have jobs. I think there should be more funding for the arts all across the world. I would answer this question about AI and literature by talking about the emerging literature of technology. So for the first decades of the internet revolution, technology journalism was very much about boosterism. It was about, oh, look, the new iPhone is coming out. Oh, look, here's this new thing that's going to change the world. And it was very one note for a while. There wasn't much nuance to it. So I'm really excited about the way that the literature of technology is changing nowadays. So I have a background as a creative nonfiction writer, in addition to being a computer scientist. So one of the things I try and do in the book is I try and tell stories that involve technology, that are true stories, but I try and take principles of literary journalism and apply them to storytelling and kind of empowerment around technology. And I think there's something really interesting happening in the literary world right now with a lot more people doing kind of more boundary-pushing, transgressive work around technology. There's a book by Sophia Noble called Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. That's a really terrific book. There's a book called Programmed Inequality by Marie Hicks, which is about how women were pushed out of the computer science profession in Britain right after computers were invented. There's a book called Brotopia by Emily Chang that is about the sexist culture of Silicon Valley. There's, of course, Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill, which I'm sure lots of people in this audience have read. So, and there's also a new newsroom starting in New York called The Markup. It's by Julia Angwin and Jeff Larson, and they're the team behind ProPublica's really groundbreaking series, Machine Bias, that looks at the ways that, that machines are biased and takes an investigative journalism approach to it. So there's all this really groundbreaking work happening, and I think it's a really exciting time for writing about technology. So I'm really excited to see what happens next.
I want to echo my support for that because technology has been changing society, but we're now starting to have a more nuanced conversation, which I think is fantastic, which both Meredith and my books actually, I think, the main purpose of my book, at least, and what I got from reading her book, which is that society gets to change technology as well. It's not something that we just have to accept. It's not something that technologists like myself or others should be forcing on society. Society gets to choose, and we should be more careful. And we haven't been very careful, and we're starting to pay some of the prices. We see with all the scandals that happen with Facebook and some of the other tech companies that we have to be more careful. And so it's great that we start to have these more nuanced conversations about how to get the best out of the technology.
Fantastic. I think which is exactly why the future is now when we start thinking about this and start making the choices. I think now we need to open it up to the audience. I'm sure we have a lot of questions.
Yeah, we have lots of hands.
The lady in the second row. Could we get her a mic, please?
While we're waiting, Toby will say that that's a great point. We don't have to look at technology as something that happens to us. We have agency in what decisions are made with technology. We have agency. We can decide, okay, this technology is interfering with our democratic norms, and we do not want to get it. We do not want to let things go further, and we can put in regulation. We can have a dialogue about this.
Yeah, we definitely need to put in more regulation. We've given technology and the technology giants too much of a free hand, and we're seeing the abuses that are being committed on us, and government is there to make sure. Free markets have brought much great innovation to our lives, disruption to our lives. Much of it's been good, but not all of it. And every market needs rules so that it actually works for the public good.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we'll go with the questions at the back. I think there's a gentleman there.
Thank you very much for your very illusion.
Sorry, could you speak up, please?
Thank you very much for your very good session. My question is for both of you. regarding what is the future of lending institutions in the AI. And the second is, what will be the future of literature in the sort of AI? Will the machines will start generating poems or novels? And what will be the future of the lending institutions?
I think we'll talk about the first one because you both of you did speak about literature a bit. Lending institutions and AI.
Well, there's a bigger question than lending industries, which is the whole AI and the financial technology and AI and risk, because lending is really just a way of calculating risk and working out. And that's a real challenge, and one that it's not a technological question, it's a societal question, which is that if we can use data to better calculate risk, we can actually price things better, and the finance industry will make more money, they will lend money more effectively. But that may, we find out, lend money not to women or lend money not to young people. And we may have to work out that we need to say to companies, for example, in Europe now, you cannot price insurance depending on sex. So life insurance, car insurance has to be independent of your sex. The result of which because otherwise you can actually price insurance so that people pay more according to their sex. That has a consequence, which means that women now pay more for car insurance, paying for more bad men driving. That was a decision that the European governments made, that they wanted insurance to be fair against these sorts of discriminations. But it doesn't, it won't be with AI, it won't just be sex, it will be every sort of feature and characteristic you can imagine. So you have to ask yourself, well, what do we want in terms of equality of access to these sorts of things, like lending money or insurance? Because the tools will be there to price things exactly.
I think that's right, and I also think that something happens when technologists are presented with a rule like you cannot price insurance based on gender. They say, okay, well, I'm going to make a model, and I'm not going to use gender, but they don't take into account the fact that there are all kinds of variables that are equally predictive of gender. Or in the U.S., the big issue is not just discrimination by sex, but it's discrimination by race. And this comes up a lot in lending because people of color are often denied, say, mortgages at a higher rate than white people. And there are all kinds of variables that predict race, like zip code, for example, because the US has a lot of residential segregation. So even if you're not putting in to your model, oh, this person is African American, oh, this person is Asian American, if you are putting in something like zip code is really predictive of race. So if you're using zip code as a factor, you're actually still violating the law. You're still doing the thing that you're not supposed to be doing. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to open up the black boxes of algorithms. We need to be more transparent about the machine learning models that are being used to make decisions about risk. And if I can be, if I can go super nerdy for a second, the search term is information fiduciary to look into. So the idea is there would be a trusted third party who would have access to the proprietary information or the proprietary model that the bank is using, and the fiduciary would keep that secret, but they would be able to audit that model and make sure that the bank is not making decisions based on prohibited categories.
Sure, yes. Do you have a mic?
Hello. I work in the technology for development space, and I was wondering what your take is on face recognition for the underprivileged who don't have formal identity.
I'm increasingly with the view that we should just not do face recognition with computers. There are just so much harm that you can do with face recognition software, and there are so few benefits compared to the risks that I do think increasingly you see in China today face recognition being used to suppress religious minorities. The potential upsides are just so small. The potential risks that bad actors will use this technology to do harm to our lives, to our society, that it will be across. I mean, this is the thing that when you ask the question right at the start, what should we be worrying about? It's not Terminator. It's what those great writers told us about, Orwell and Huxley. It's some melange between 1984 and Brave New World. And face recognition is one of those technologies that would fit right in there to give you that Brave New World.
Yeah, facial recognition technology absolutely should not be used in policing. We definitely need a lot more regulation around facial recognition technology. There's an organization in the US called the Algorithmic Justice League that is doing some really amazing work around the flaws of facial recognition technology, and they're working against its use in policing. And that's led by Joy Bolamwini, who's a PhD student at the MIT Media Lab. So definitely check out the Algorithmic Justice League. I think there was an article about them in the Times recently. Another thing about these facial recognition systems is that they are optimized for pale males. They do a much better job of recognizing white men as opposed to recognizing darker-skinned women. And a lot of technologists will take that information and say, oh, well, clearly the solution is we just make it better, we train the model to be better at recognizing darker-skinned women. And no, that's not the solution. We need technology that works well for all kinds and colors of people, and we also need that technology to be used fairly. Because when these systems are deployed, especially in policing, they are disproportionately deployed against communities of color.
I just, before we go off the topic of face recognition, just because I think it's such a challenge to our societal norms. As another example, again, it's taken from China, which was there was an announcement a couple of months back where they arrested a person that they spotted using face recognition in a rock concert of a crowd of 50,000 people. Now, it used to be when you were in a crowd of 50,000 people, you're going and protesting against the government, you were anonymous. The technology prevents that. It will change the face of the world we're in, the way that we can protest against governments, because you won't be anonymous in a crowd anymore. And these are the sort of things, along with all the other things that Meredith was mentioning about bias and so on, that we really have to be worried about. And I really do think we just shouldn't do face recognition.
Sure. A fun fact about facial recognition technology and protesting, though, is you can use makeup to defeat facial recognition systems. So the same way that the image recognition systems in cars can be defeated by the sparkly unicorn sticker on the stop sign, what some activists do is they use makeup to defeat the facial recognition system. So if you put triangles and rectangles and black and white on your face, the systems are so fragile that they no longer recognize that as a face.
Right, let's move on to the next question. The gentleman in the middle there, please, there, on, yes, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the recognition. So my question is regarding as a policymaker in terms of AI and big data. When I talk about, is there even a possibility of keeping the track of technologies which keep changing rapidly in today's time, as compared to the threats that are there, as compared to because there is no international consensus on the definition of AI as such. There is no international consensus on how do we deal with big data even in the UN. So considering that even though there are research papers out there which do teach us and talk us about, especially by MIT as well. But still, there is no application of it towards working towards it. It's not even at the ground level, even by the governments. So do you think that we'll be able to form a consensus or form certain safeguards and guidelines where we will be able to keep the track of such technology so that they're not being used at a level that it is rather harming so much rather than benefiting us?
I think the question is about regulation.
Yeah. We definitely need more regulation. We haven't regulated it hard enough. Governments have let us down in that respect. But and it's a difficult problem. I mean, politicians who I spend more and more of my life talking to tend not to understand the technology. But there are things you can do. You can regulate outcomes, not technology. So you can regulate the impact that the technology, whatever form it may look, will have, as opposed to regulating particular technologies. A lot of it has to be about regulation about data and privacy. And there are bright hopes there. I mean, we only have to look to Europe, where actually most of the best work is going on actually in terms of implementation of regulation. And the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that came into effect last May, is a good example. It's only the beginning. It's not the end of what we need, but it's a good example that you can regulate. And in fact, if you don't regulate, we will stifle innovation. There was a long period where people thought if we regulate, we will stifle the innovation that has brought much great useful disruption to our lives. We're now discovering that if we don't regulate, we will stifle innovation. And GDPR has been a great benefit. I don't know if its impact has been felt in India, but its impact, I know, was felt back for me in Australia, where most of the tech companies have applied the same GDPR rights to Australia, even though it's not required by law to Australian citizens. So data rights have been given to not just Europe from GDPR. So I think that's a good example of how we need to focus on this problem, and that there is hope that we can actually make progress.
Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned that you felt that writers' jobs were safe. What is it about creativity that you think requires a human touch? For example, I can give you 3 examples of where machines are already encroaching on creativity. There's a book called Haiku by Man and Machine, in which it's a compilation of haiku, some written by men and some by machine, and they have not mentioned which is by which. And then there's another musical program, Experiments in Musical Intelligence, in which they played it to a concert hall, and nobody could tell which one was a Beethoven piece and which one was an EMI, Experiments in Musical Intelligence piece. After being told that the piece was by a machine, they said, it lacked some depth, it was too perfect. So I don't know what is it about the human soul, so-called, that creativity requires a human soul. I'm not so sure about that. What made you say that?
Well, that's a lovely question. I think the real story, the story about music's been a little convoluted. There was an experiment where they got a human to make music in the style of Bach. They got a computer to make music in the style of Bach, and they got some Bach, and then they got the audience to rate which was the best Bach. I'm pleased to say that Bach won. Bach was the best Bach, obviously, because he is a fantastic composer. But the human came last. So that's, if you like, the Turing test for Bach. So we can already write Bach-like music with a computer better than most composers can. But my point is the one that I alluded to before, which is that so maybe we can, on a functional level, get computers to do those things. But Bach is special because he was a one-off. Bach is special because he touches our soul, he touches our hearts. He was a human like us, and we can feel the love and the loss that he had, that's lived on through centuries. And none of that will ever come from machines, because they have no soul, they have no consciousness, they have no loves. They will never lose anyone.
Right. Yes, the lady.
Hello? Okay. I understand human error and correcting human error. This is for Toby. But are you more interested in the evolution of technology or the evolution of humans? For example, I see the evolution of technology as a way to put aside objective issues and problems and thus evolve further, because obviously we're not the end-all if all time.
A fantastic question. Thank you very much. I'm a humanist at heart, so I see the technology as a way of giving us time to be more human. And whenever we automate a job, I normally think we should be celebrating that we're now not getting humans to do dull, dangerous, dirty, repetitive things that we should never have got them to do. And if we get more time because the machines take more of the sweat, then we can spend more time doing the things that are important to us. And hopefully we will evolve as a species. Hopefully we will become better through it. And we face so many wicked problems. I think we have to embrace the technology so that we can go on to do all the magnificent things that humans have done.
Yeah, the gentleman in the second row.
Yes, myself is Meredith Broussard Singh. I'm a creative writer for the University of Calcutta. My mind was just arrested when you were speaking about Lord Byron. In what way you are connecting to Lord Byron with technologies? What I want to say is this, that about technological awareness, what you were just now discussed, kindly just expand your notion.
The illegitimate...
What did you say about Lord Byron?
The illegitimate daughter of Lord Byron, who sadly he never recognized in his life, was Ada Lovelace, who was a mathematical prodigy in the 1800s, which was a great achievement because women weren't formally allowed to study in universities then. And she was the first computer programmer. So we should celebrate the fact that computer programmers, the first computer programmer was a woman, and we should have more of them since.
Yes, the fourth row, you're there.
Good morning, sir. So I want to ask that humans dreamed of flying, but it took them over 1,000 years to make that dream, for them to actually fly. So are we burdening the technology with our imagination to get it fast and done? We haven't get rid of the Apple Watch yet.
Meredith.
And Tesla has already, the autonomous cars, ma'am, you said that it's from 1991, they are saying coming soon, coming soon. So will artificial intelligence actually exist in the upcoming years? That's what my question is.
Well, artificial intelligence already exists. But
the way we want to see it.
Well, I mean, I think maybe the way you want it to and the way I want it to exist are different. So I think that we need to acknowledge that when one person says artificial intelligence, they actually sometimes mean something different than when another person says artificial intelligence, and that people's visions of the world that they want can differ. So we're not all operating with the same worldview. And so in computer science, you do kind of want standards, and you do want to program for one thing, but that's not actually how the world works. So we can go to mathematics, for example. So in math, what you're doing in math is you're looking for these universal principles, right? Like the Pythagorean theorem works the same way all the time, and it's beautiful that it works the same way all the time and in every situation. And what computers do is they literally compute, right? They're machines that do math. It's really like complex and gorgeous math, but it's just math. So when you are looking for a mathematical explanation of something, you're looking for something different than when you're looking to solve a social problem. And so the idea that we would be able to make a machine that is as good as a human, like I would say, like, let's examine that notion, because like we already have humans and they're pretty great. And they do all these wonderful things, and they have all this creativity, and it's not like we're making fewer humans, right? So we're going to continue to need jobs, we're going to continue to need food, we're going to continue to need transportation. So, let's make a world that is good for humans as opposed to making a world that's good for machines.
I'm reminded of that quote, which is that we always underestimate what we will, overestimate what we'll do in the short term and underestimate what we'll achieve in the long term. And we really are. I mean, this is a scientific field, and the wonderful thing about science that not enough people realize is it's an exponential process. There are more scientists alive today than have ever lived. And that's why the world is getting better, because of all the things that science has brought us, that has eliminated disease, and AI is just going to be one of those other tools that will help us, hopefully, if we're careful, to make the world a better place.
Right.
But we need to be careful about how we use it, like any technology.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. The lady behind.
All right, it's the last one. Make it a good one.
No pressure.
Good morning. I just wanted to know about the role of AI in medicine. I'm a general practitioner, and I want to know how many years I've got before I'll run out of getting jobs.
So in my book...
secondly, anything I can do to upgrade my education to get in sync with AI, so that
you can read my book.
So the good news, if you're a GP, in my book I actually predict there will be greater and greater demand for GPs because we'll have much more preventative health care. And the doctors should be worried of the specialists, because those are the ones where we might start automating, radiology and things like that. But at the end of the day, we need a sympathetic face like yours to tell us the bad news about what's going to go wrong with us.
Wonderful. I think that's a great way to conclude this discussion. Meredith and Toby, thank you so much for being here and talking to us about AI. The future is now.
Thank you.
And thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Do remember, both their books are available, and they would be there to sign the books. Thank you.